Snow sifted down from a pewter sky, light as ash shaken from a hearth long gone cold. It softened the angles of the town, rounding the roof lines, muffling the creak of signboards on their chains. The boardwalk was slick in places, the ice hidden under fresh powder. Smoke climbed from a few chimneys, thin and pale, bending east with the wind. Far off, a train whistle cried once, then faded, leaving only the groan of timber in the cold. Windows glowed faint in the dim afternoon, but no one lingered outside. Even the stray dogs had found shelter. It was the sort of day when a person felt the smallness of themselves, the weight of distance, and the ache of being unseen. She stepped down from the train, boots crunching into snow packed hard by earlier arrivals. Ada Rose's coat strained at the seams, the buttons polished dull by years of use. Her cheeks burned from the wind, her breath a silver fog before her face. She paused, scanning the platform, her gloved hand tightening on the handle of her carpet bag. The letter in her pocket, creased and sweat-stained, spoke of a man who would meet her here, a man who wanted a wife before Christmas. But the platform was near empty, and those few who passed looked through her as if she were smoke. She felt the slow drop in her chest that came when hope began to cool. A small voice rose beside her boots. "You need a husband and I need a mommy." The words, plain and unshy, startled Ada from her searching. A girl stood there, no more than 7, in a coat patched so many times the fabric had become a quilt of stranger's cloth. Her hair, a loose tangle, was damp with melting snow. She blinked up, solemn but not sad, as though she were stating a simple fact about the weather. In her chapped hands she held a stick of peppermint, broken clean in half, one end offered up without ceremony. Ada could only stare, the heat of embarrassment rising even in the cold. Across the street, a man leaned against a post outside the general store. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a hat pulled low against the wind. He didn't call out or wave, he simply watched. The girl turned from Ada and ran to him, boots scuffing the snow. He bent slightly to hear what she whispered, his gaze flicking back toward the platform. Ada looked away, pretending to fuss with her bag, but she could feel the measure of his eyes. Her throat tightened. The thought came unbidden, he's the one who was meant to meet me, and she hated the sting of hope it brought. The man crossed the street at an easy pace, the girl skipping behind him. He stopped a yard away, close enough for Ada to see the pale scar that curved under his left eye. "Train's late," he said quietly, as though they were already acquainted. She nodded, unsure if it was a question or a statement. He looked past her at the emptying platform, then back. "You got someplace warm to go?" The words were simple, but the way he asked them, without pity, without hurry, made them heavier than they seemed. Before she could answer, the girl stepped between them, slipping her small hand into Ada's gloved one. The contact startled her more than the question. The girl's fingers were ice cold, but she held on with certainty, as if the matter had already been decided. Ada glanced toward the station office, wondering if the man she was promised might still appear, but all she saw was a clerk snuffing the last of the lanterns. Snow was thickening, falling faster now. The man gestured toward a wagon hitched a little way down the street. "It's a long walk to the ranch in this," he said, and turned as if he expected her to follow. The girl tugged at Ada's hand, peppermint still clutched in the other. She hesitated on the boardwalk. Pride rose like a hand on her shoulder, urging her to stay put. If she left now, it would mean admitting, to herself most of all, that she'd been abandoned. That the man who wrote her letters, who called her dear on paper, had seen her in truth and decided against it. The shame was a stone in her gut, and the eyes of the few townsfolk still abroad seemed to press it deeper. One woman paused under the awning of the post office, whispering to the man beside her. Ada caught the word fat the way one catches a thorn, sharp and small but enough to draw blood. The girl pulled again, insistent. Ada looked down and saw the child's lower lip trembling from cold, the tip of her nose red and raw. Without quite knowing why, she stepped off the boardwalk into the street. Snow squeaked under her boots, the hem of her coat dragging. The man waited by the wagon, one gloved hand on the sideboard. He gave a single nod when she drew close, nothing more. She climbed in, settling her carpet bag between her feet. The girl scrambled up beside her, tucking the broken peppermint into Ada's palm before leaning against her arm. It was so natural, so unearned, that Ada didn't know whether to pull away or hold on. The wagon lurched forward, the iron rims of the wheels creaking against the cold. The town slid by, frost-rimmed windows, shuttered doors, the muted glow of lamps in the deepening gray. No one called after them. Snow settled in Ada's hair where her bonnet left it bare. She tried to speak, to ask the man his name, but the words felt heavy in her mouth. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, shoulders hunched against the wind. The girl began humming under her breath, a tune without shape as if she were keeping herself company. Ada let the sound fill the silence between them, unfamiliar yet oddly steadying. They passed the last cluster of buildings and the open land took over. Fences half buried in drifts, stands of bare cottonwood, a creek frozen under glassy ice. The air grew sharper, the cold biting at her ankles through worn boots. She thought of the station behind them, of the letter still in her pocket, of the name she'd practiced saying aloud in case someone asked who she belonged to. That name seemed smaller now, insubstantial, like smoke from a snuffed candle. She shifted her carpetbag to her lap, fingers tracing the seam where the fabric had begun to fray. The peppermint in her palm was warming slightly from her skin. After a while, the man spoke, his voice low, almost lost to the crunch of snow under the wheels. "I'm Jonah," he said, not looking at her. She nodded once, unsure if he expected her to answer in kind. "That's May," he added, tilting his head toward the girl. The child grinned briefly, then went back to watching the fields roll past. Ada opened her mouth to give her own name, but the wind seemed to steal it before it could form. Jonah didn't press. The wagon hit a rut and she reached to steady May, the girl leaning into her side without resistance. The sky was deepening toward night when Jonah turned the team toward a narrow track bordered by snow-heavy pines. The trees made a tunnel, their branches sagging low enough to brush the wagon's cover. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Ada's hands had gone numb, but she kept them still, unwilling to fuss and seem ungrateful. She wondered if this was how her life would be from now on, moving quietly beside strangers, holding her discomfort like a secret. Then May's small hand found hers again under the blanket Jonah had tossed across their laps, and something in her chest eased, if only by a thread. They emerged from the trees into a clearing where a cabin stood, its roof mounded with snow. Light leaked from the single window, gold against the white. Smoke rose from the chimney, sharper now, edged with the scent of pine. Jonah pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He offered his hand to May first, then turned to Ada. She hesitated, not from distrust, but from the sudden awareness of how it might feel to be steadied. His grip was firm, unhurried. She stepped down, the snow giving under her boots. The warmth from the cabin seemed to reach only as far as the porch. Jonah led the team toward the small lean-to beside the cabin, leaving her and May at the steps. The girl bounded up, stomping snow from her boots, then turned and beckoned Ada inside. She followed, the air within wrapping around her like a quilt, wood smoke, baking bread, the faint sweetness of dried apples. Her eyes adjusted slowly, picking out the table near the hearth, the rocker in the corner, a braided rug worn thin in spots. May shrugged off her coat and darted toward the stove. Ada stayed near the door, unsure how far she was meant to go. Her fingers found the broken peppermint again, and she closed her fist around it. Jonah returned, hanging his hat by the door. He glanced at her once, then crossed to the stove. "Stew's still warm," he said. May was already reaching for bowls, her small hands practiced. Ada's stomach tightened with hunger, but her feet felt rooted. Jonah didn't insist, didn't coax. He simply set a third bowl on the table, steam curling up into the dim lamplight. The fire snapped, sending a brief halo of sparks up the flue. She thought of the station again, of how easily she could have stayed there, waiting for someone who would never come. The choice she'd made in stepping into the wagon seemed at once reckless and necessary. May slid onto the bench, patting the space beside her. "It's warm here," she said softly, as if offering more than just a seat. Ada took it, the heat from the stew rising into her face. Jonah ate quietly, his presence solid but not pressing. Snow tapped against the window in restless flurries. Ada lifted the spoon, the broth rich and steadying on her tongue. For the first time since she stepped off the train, the hollow in her chest eased a little. She glanced at May, who was watching her with a small, satisfied smile, as though some private agreement had been reached. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters. Jonah set down his spoon, listening. His gaze shifted to the door, then back to Ada. Something in his expression, alert, unreadable, made her skin prickle. He reached for another log to lay on the fire, but kept his eyes on her a moment longer than necessary, as though there was more he wanted to say and hadn't. She found herself gripping the edge of the table, the warmth of the stew forgotten. The room felt both safe and suspended, as if it could tip either way. Then from outside a voice called her name, clear, familiar, and far too close. The voice outside faded into the wind, but it left the air inside charged, as if the walls themselves were listening. Ada's hand tightened around her spoon. She knew that voice, knew the exact turn of its vowels and the way it could sound kind even when it carried cruelty. Her breath came quicker, the stew in front of her cooling untouched. Jonah's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, steady but unreadable, before he rose from the table and went to the door. He opened it just enough to step out, the cold sliding in like a knife. May's eyes followed him, wide and unblinking. "You know him?" she whispered, though it felt less like a question than an observation. Ada shook her head, not in denial but in refusal to name what she knew. She stood, her legs unsteady, and drifted toward the hearth as if the fire could keep the memory at bay. The wood popped and hissed, the heat licking at her cheeks. She could hear Jonah's voice outside, low and measured, like a man talking to a skittish horse. Then the sound of footsteps crunching away. When Jonah returned, his coat was dusted with snow. He shut the door without comment and went back to the table. His silence was not the silence of someone ignoring a thing, it was the silence of someone holding it until it was ready to be spoken. Ada sat again, her hands folded in her lap. She wanted to ask who it was, what had been said, but the weight in Jonah's eyes told her enough. Whoever had called her name had not been invited to the fire. They ate in quiet. May hummed to herself, dipping bread into her stew, her small shoulders curving in contentment. Ada tried to focus on the food, on the simple act of lifting spoon to mouth, but the knot in her stomach remained. The stew was hearty, filled with potatoes and bits of venison, seasoned with something she couldn't quite place. It was the kind of meal that should have settled her, but she felt instead like an interloper at someone else's table, a shape out of place in the composition of their lives. After the meal, May gathered the bowls and carried them to the basin without being asked. Jonah poured hot water from the kettle, the steam fogging the air. Ada moved to help, rolling up her sleeves, but paused when she saw how naturally the two of them worked together. May washing, Jonah rinsing, their movements practiced and wordless. She felt herself standing outside of it, a figure in the doorway watching a scene framed by lamplight. Jonah noticed her hesitation. "There's wood to be brought in," he said, not unkindly. His tone was the same as when he'd asked if she had a place to go, measured, giving her a choice without dressing it as one. She nodded, pulling her coat tighter and stepping out into the night. The cold bit her face, the snow now falling in fine, slanting lines. She found the woodpile by the side of the cabin, her breath puffing in white bursts as she gathered an armful. The logs were heavy, the bark rough against her skin even through the gloves. Inside again, she set the wood by the hearth, the sharp scent of fresh-cut pine mixing with the smoke. May had finished the dishes and was now curled in the rocker, a blanket draped over her legs. Jonah stood near the table, mending a strap with slow, deliberate stitches. The lamplight caught on the pale scar under his eye. Ada sat on the floor by the fire, stretching her hands toward the flames. She could feel the heat begin to sink into her bones, loosening the tension in her shoulders. May reached into the blanket and pulled out a folded paper. "I made this earlier," she said, her voice shy but certain. She crossed the room and placed it in Ada's hands. It was a drawing in thick pencil lines, 3 figures standing under a large sun, holding hands. One was tall and broad, one small with pigtails and one rounder, with a dress that reached the ground. Ada's throat tightened. She traced the crude lines of the dress, the way the figures leaned toward each other. "It's us," May explained as though it needed saying. Ada folded the paper carefully and slid it into her coat pocket. "Thank you," she managed, her voice low. She wasn't sure if the girl understood how rarely she'd been given something made only for her, not as part of a bargain or a duty. Jonah glanced up from his work but said nothing, his eyes flicking from the drawing to Ada's face before returning to his stitching. The hours slipped by in the quiet way they do when winter owns the night. Jonah banked the fire, the cabin settling into its softer rhythms, wind at the shutters, the faint creak of timbers adjusting in the cold. May disappeared into a small room off the main one, her footsteps light on the floorboards. Jonah showed Ada to another room across the cabin. It was simple, a narrow bed, a quilt folded at the foot, a small chest by the window. The air was cold enough to make her breath visible. "I'll keep the fire going in here tonight," Jonah said, setting a few logs into the stove in the corner. He struck a match, the flare lighting his face for an instant before settling into the kindling. Cold has a way of creeping in where it's not wanted. There was a flicker in his expression when he said it, as if he meant more than just the weather. Ada stood by the bed, unsure what to do with her hands. She wanted to thank him, but the words felt too small. He nodded once, then left, the door closing softly behind him. She undressed in the lamplight, folding her clothes neatly over the chair. Her body was both shield and betrayal. It carried the proof of every mile, every hunger, every gaze that had measured her worth by how little space she took up. She slipped under the quilt, pulling it to her chin. The stove's new fire crackled, but the cold still lingered in the corners of the room. She lay awake, the drawing in her coat pocket a small weight against the wall. Somewhere in the night she heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, pause outside her door. Then the quiet scrape of metal on metal as the stove door opened. A log slid in, the sound of it settling into the coals. No knock, no voice, just the steady work of keeping the cold at bay. She closed her eyes, unsure whether the warmth she felt was from the fire or the act itself. When morning came, the light was gray and thin through the frost on the window. She dressed quickly, her breath misting in the air, and stepped into the main room. Jonah was already by the stove, frying something in a cast-iron pan. The smell of salt pork and bread filled the space. May sat at the table, braiding a length of string into a bracelet. "You sleep all right?" Jonah asked, his voice rough from the cold air. Ada nodded, though the truth was more complicated. They ate together, the clink of utensils the only sound for a while. Ada noticed the way Jonah poured the last of the coffee into her cup without asking, or how May slid the salt closer to her without taking her eyes off her plate. These were small things, unremarkable to anyone else, but they lodged in her like seeds. After breakfast, Jonah mentioned needing to check the stock and mend a section of fence before the snow buried it for good. May offered to help with chores inside, and Ada volunteered to join Jonah. His glance was quick, assessing, but he said only, "All right." They dressed in coats and scarves, stepping out into the crisp air. The snow squeaked underfoot, the sky a hard, clear blue. The walk to the fence was quiet but not strained. Jonah carried a coil of wire and a small hammer, his breath steady. Ada followed, the hem of her coat brushing the snow. She watched the way his boots left deep prints, how he didn't hurry despite the cold. At the fence line, he showed her how to hold the wire taut while he hammered it in place. Their hands brushed once, a brief contact that neither acknowledged. By the time they finished, the sun was low, gilding the snow in pale gold. On the walk back, Jonah asked almost casually, "Who was it at the door last night?" Ada's breath caught. She'd hoped the question wouldn't come, or at least not so soon. "Someone I knew once," she said, the words tasting of iron. Jonah didn't press, but his jaw tightened. "He won't come here again," he said simply. It was not a promise, but a statement of fact. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had the night before. May was at the table with a row of wooden buttons, sorting them by size. She looked up and grinned. "You came back," she said as if it were in question. Ada smiled faintly, hanging her coat by the door. She could feel the drawing in its pocket, the folded lines worn a little deeper from her fingers. That night, after the fire was banked and May had gone to bed, Ada lingered by the hearth. Jonah sat at the table, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. The lamplight caught on the shavings falling like curls around his boots. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly, not looking up. "But you can if you want." The words were a rope thrown across a gap, one she wasn't sure she could cross. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, there was a sharp knock at the door, louder, heavier than the night before. Jonah set down the carving, his eyes meeting hers across the room. In them was no surprise, only a steadiness that made her pulse quicken. The knock came again, the sound echoing in the small space. Ada's hand drifted to her coat pocket, feeling the soft crinkle of May's drawing. She didn't know yet if she would stay or leave, but she knew one thing. Whoever stood outside was not bringing the kind of warmth she had found here. The knock at the door that night had not been answered, not by words at least. Jonah opened it just wide enough to speak in a low tone to the man outside, a shadowed figure with frost on his shoulders, and whatever passed between them ended with the sound of boots crunching away through snow. Ada had not asked who it was. She had learned that some answers only confirm what you already fear, and she had enough of those stored up inside her. 2 days later, Jonah mentioned needing supplies in town. The storm had broken, leaving the air brittle and the roads patched with ice. May, bright-eyed at the thought of a trip, pleaded to come along. Jonah looked at Ada. "You too if you want." His voice was even, as though the choice carried no weight. She hesitated. Going into town meant faces, and faces meant eyes, and eyes meant judgment. Yet part of her wanted to see where she had arrived, to prove to herself she could walk among them without shrinking. She nodded. May grinned and fetched her coat. The wagon's wheels cut through shallow drifts, the sound of iron on frozen ruts ringing in the stillness. The world around them was all white and gray and the muted brown of leafless trees. Jonah drove without hurry, his gloved hands loose on the reins. May sat between them, her small legs swinging. Ada kept her gaze forward, though every so often she caught Jonah's glance at her from the side, measuring something she couldn't name. The town appeared first as smoke rising from chimneys, then as the jagged rooflines and faded paint of buildings standing shoulder to shoulder. They passed the station where she'd first stepped into this place. For an instant she saw herself there again, coat too tight, eyes searching for someone who would not come, and the memory tightened her throat. Jonah pulled up in front of the general store. He stepped down first, lifting May to the boardwalk before offering Ada his hand. She took it without thinking, the warmth of his grip lingering longer than it should have. Inside, the store was crowded with the smell of coffee beans and oiled leather. A small bell above the door announced their arrival, drawing glances from those already shopping. Conversations didn't stop, but they bent, voices lowering, tones shifting. A woman in a dark bonnet leaned toward her companion, her eyes cutting toward Ada. The words were too soft to catch, but the lift of the other woman's brows said enough. Jonah moved easily through the aisles, picking up nails, lamp oil, a sack of flour. May darted ahead to the section with bolts of cloth, running her fingers over the colors. Ada followed more slowly, aware of how the floorboard seemed louder beneath her boots. At the counter, a clerk with a thin mustache rang up Jonah's purchases. His eyes flicked to Ada. "That all?" Jonah nodded. "Unless the lady needs anything." The man's gaze dropped to her midsection in a way that made her want to fold in on herself. "We've got new fabric in smaller cuts for smaller ladies. Might suit you better than wasting coin on extra." Heat flushed her cheeks. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, May piped up from beside her, voice carrying across the room, "She's going to be my mama." The clerk blinked, then gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jonah said nothing, only slid the coins across the counter with a deliberate slowness that made the man look away. Outside, the cold was a relief. Ada pulled her scarf higher, the air burning her lungs. Jonah loaded the supplies into the wagon. May climbed up and sat in her place, swinging her feet. Ada lingered by the hitching post, staring at the tracks their boots had left in the thin crust of snow. They made 2 more stops, the blacksmith for hinges, the feed store for grain. At each place she felt the glance and turn of strangers. No one said anything to her directly, but she could feel the weight of the words they weren't speaking. On the way back to the wagon from the feed store, 2 men leaned against the wall outside, smoking. Their voices were low but carried just enough on the wind for her to catch the shape of their sentences. "Big woman for him, ain't she?" one said. The other chuckled. "Guess he's not as particular as I thought." Ada's steps faltered. She stared at the ground, willing her face not to betray anything. She felt Jonah slow beside her. He didn't look at the men, didn't answer them, but when they passed, his hand brushed lightly against her elbow, a touch that was both grounding and unspoken shield. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. May hummed to herself, unaware or unbothered. Ada kept her hands folded in her lap, staring at the horizon where the snow met the sky. She tried to tell herself that words didn't matter, that she had lived through worse, but each one lodged like grit under the skin. By the time they reached the cabin, the light was thinning. Jonah carried the heavier items inside, while May helped Ada with the rest. The warmth of the fire was immediate, but the cold inside her didn't lift. She set the sack of flour on the table and began to untie her scarf. May appeared at her side, holding a scrap of paper. "I made another," she said proudly. Ada unfolded it, another drawing, this time just 2 figures holding hands, the smaller one looking up at the taller. She recognized the tilt of the taller figure's shoulders as her own. Something in her chest tightened. She smiled faintly, thanking May, and slipped it into her coat pocket beside the first drawing. That night, after supper, she lay awake in the small room, staring at the shadowed ceiling. The words from town replayed in her mind, mingling with the sight of Jonah's steady profile as he ignored them. The contrast unsettled her, how the world could strip you down with a glance, and how one man could give you space without demanding you fill it. By the next morning, she'd made a decision. She couldn't stay long enough for those words to take root. Not here. Not where a child might hear them and learn something about herself she didn't deserve to learn. She rose early before the stove's fire was rekindled, and began to pack her bag. The room was cold, her breath visible as she folded her few dresses and tucked away the small tin that held her sewing needles. She paused when her fingers brushed the folded drawings. For a moment she considered leaving them behind. They belonged to this place, to this child, not to her. But she couldn't bring herself to set them down. In the main room, Jonah was at the table with a mug of coffee, his hair damp from washing. He looked up, his eyes taking in the bag in her hand. "Going somewhere?" She opened her mouth to explain, but the words tangled. "I think it's better if I don't." She stopped, unable to finish. Jonah's gaze didn't waver. He set down the mug and leaned back in his chair. "If you go, I won't stop you," he said. There was no anger in it, no challenge, just the plain weight of truth. But don't leave thinking you've got to earn a place before you sit at this table. Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask why, to demand what he thought he saw in her worth staying for, but she knew she wouldn't survive hearing the answer, whatever it was. She nodded once, turned, and opened the door. The air outside was knife-sharp, the snow underfoot squealing with each step. She didn't look back. The sound of the door closing behind her was swallowed quickly by the wind. Ahead, the road stretched pale and empty, bordered by the dark arms of bare trees. She walked until the cabin disappeared from view, her hand brushing the pocket where May's drawings rested like a pulse. The horizon wavered in the distance, heatless and white. Somewhere behind her, a dog barked once, twice, then went quiet. She kept walking. The house felt different before the sun was even up. Jonah noticed it the moment his boots touched the floorboards, an absence in the air, a space where sound should be. He stoked the stove out of habit, though the fire seemed reluctant to catch, as if it too sensed what was missing. When he stepped to the small room she had slept in, the bed was neatly made, the folded quilt square on the corner. No coat hung by the door. No bag in the corner. He stood there longer than he meant to, taking in the stillness. He'd known the look in her eyes when she left the table the night before, like a deer that's decided it won't survive the next shot. Still, he'd hoped she'd stay one more morning, long enough to see what living here could be when it wasn't all doubt. May padded out from her room, hair mussed, still warm from sleep. "Where's Ada?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Jonah didn't answer right away. He poured coffee into his mug, letting the steam rise between them like a barrier. "She left early," he said finally. The child's brow furrowed. "Did she stop wanting us?" The question was so direct it pulled something in him taut. He set the mug down, unsure how to tell a girl that sometimes people leave not because they stop wanting, but because wanting feels like it costs too much. May wandered to the window, pressing her palm to the cold glass. The yard was empty, the path to the road faint under a dusting of new snow. She stood there for a long time before disappearing into her room. When she returned, she held one of her drawings, the one of the two of them holding hands, and placed it on the windowsill. "In case she comes back," she said. The rest of the day wore on like a coat too heavy for its wearer. Jonah worked the chores in silence, his movements steady but without their usual rhythm. He hauled water, checked the stock, split wood until his shoulders ached, but none of it seemed to take the edge off. The cabin without her was the same shape, the same air, but it carried a hollowness that settled in the corners like dust. Out on the road, Ada walked with her bag in hand, the snow crunching under each step. She kept her eyes on the ruts ahead, not on the horizon. She'd found a small boarding house 2 towns over, a place with thin walls and a keeper who asked no questions. The room smelled faintly of coal and boiled cabbage. She told herself it was only for a few nights, long enough to think. But thinking brought no comfort. At night, she lay under a coarse blanket, listening to the sounds of strangers moving in the rooms around her. Once, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out May's first drawing. She traced the pencil lines with her finger, the round figure, the small one with pigtails, the tall one who could only be Jonah. She hadn't meant to take it with her, not really. Yet here it was, and the longer she held it, the harder it was to set it aside. Back at the ranch, the evening meal was quieter than most. May picked at her bread, her usual chatter gone. Jonah poured her more stew, but she shook her head. "She didn't even say goodbye," May murmured. Jonah met her gaze. "Sometimes people think leaving is the kinder thing," he said. It was all he could offer. The next morning, Jonah was hitching the wagon when May came out with her coat half-buttoned. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To town," he said. She climbed up beside him without another question. The road stretched pale under a wide sky, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. They passed the station, then the turnoff to the church, then the last of the buildings before the open land took over. Jonah's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the distance. Ada was standing outside the boarding house when they arrived, her bag at her feet. She saw the wagon before she heard it, the crunch of wheels over ice carrying across the street. Jonah didn't call out. He simply pulled the team to a stop and looked at her. She expected him to tell her she was wrong, to ask her why she'd left. Instead he said, "We don't need fixing. Just a place to belong." The words were quiet, but they cut through the noise in her head. She looked at him, then at May, whose face was half hidden in her scarf, eyes wide and uncertain. Ada's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag. The wind tugged at her skirt, the cold pressing through her boots. She didn't know yet if she would climb into the wagon, but she knew she couldn't turn away from those words. Something in them was truer than anything she'd carried here with her. The choice hung between them, as thin and sharp as the winter air. The wind bit at her cheeks as she stood in the street, the boarding house door shut behind her, the wagon waiting in front. Jonah's words hung in the cold air between them, not urgent, not pleading, just true. We don't need fixing. Just a place to belong. She looked at May, who was hunched in her scarf like a bird guarding its last bit of warmth. The girl's eyes were bright, watching her with a hope so careful it seemed afraid to breathe. Ada felt the truth of it in her chest. This was not a choice about comfort, but about whether she would keep running from the small, ordinary mercies she'd been given. She stepped forward. Jonah didn't move, only shifted his hand slightly on the reins. May straightened in her seat as Ada set her bag in the wagon bed and climbed in. No words passed between them, but the space on the seat seemed to close in a way that was warmer than the blanket Jonah tossed over their knees. He clicked the team into motion, and the sound of the wheels on packed snow became the only measure of time. The ride back felt different. She noticed the way the road curved gently toward the horizon, how the bare trees scratched their shadows into the drifts. Jonah's presence beside her was steady, the kind of quiet that didn't demand filling. Every so often May leaned against her side, her small weight an anchor against the cold. Ada let it happen and didn't pull away. When the cabin came into view, smoke trailing from its chimney, Ada felt a tightening in her throat she hadn't expected. The sight of it, plain, weather-worn, small, carried a weight that reached deeper than shelter. Jonah pulled the wagon to a stop, and before he could climb down, May was out, boots scattering snow, running to the porch. She turned, arms wide, calling, "Come on," as if Ada might still change her mind. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of baking bread. Jonah set her bag by the wall and moved to take off his coat. Ada stood near the table, unsure of the shape of her place here. May darted past her, fetching a chair and tugging it closer to the fire. "You should sit here," she said, as if seating a guest of honor. Ada sat, letting the heat seep into her bones. The evening unfolded in small acts that said more than declarations could. Jonah ladled stew into 3 bowls without asking if she was hungry. May pressed a chunk of bread into her hand before taking her own. They ate with the ease of people who understood that being together didn't require filling every silence. After supper, Ada reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded drawings. She smoothed the first one, 3 figures under a wide sun, and set it on the shelf above the table. May's face lit at the sight, her smile quick and shy. "You kept it," she said. Ada nodded. "It belongs here." Jonah was mending a harness at the table, his head bent over the leather. "You'll need warmer boots before the next snow," he said, still working the needle through. It wasn't a question and it wasn't an order. It was the kind of statement that assumed a future with her in it. The next morning, the light came pale through the frosted windows. Ada rose early, pulling on her coat and stepping outside. The snow had softened in the night, and her boots sank slightly with each step toward the barn. Inside, Jonah was already there, his breath clouding in the cold, the horses shifting in their stalls. He looked up, met her eyes, and handed her a small pail without a word. She took it, falling into step beside him as they moved down the row, feeding each animal in turn. It was work, but it was the kind that settled into the body, that made space for quiet thought. By the time they stepped back into the morning air, the sun was breaking over the ridge, throwing gold onto the snow. She felt it on her face, sharp and clean. Jonah glanced at her, his mouth tipping into the barest suggestion of a smile, and for a moment she thought she could see the life he was offering her, not as rescue, but as something they might build side by side. Later, while May played near the hearth with a length of string, Ada sat at the table sewing a patch onto Jonah's work shirt. The fabric was worn thin, the tear small, but mending it felt like more than repair. It felt like participation. Jonah came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots, and paused when he saw her. He didn't thank her, just set his gloves on the table and took the shirt when she finished, as if this, too, was simply how things were meant to be. That night, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. They sat by the fire, May curled up with her blanket, Jonah in the rocker, Ada across from him. The quiet between them was different now, less space to fill, more space to rest in. May, half asleep, murmured something Ada couldn't catch. Jonah looked over, his gaze steady. "She called you Mama?" he said softly. The words sank into her like warmth after a long cold. She didn't answer, afraid her voice might betray more than she was ready to give. But she reached over and brushed a strand of hair from May's forehead, letting her hand rest there for a moment longer than necessary. When Jonah banked the fire for the night, Ada stood at the window. Snowflakes drifted in the lamplight, each one vanishing as it touched the glass. She thought of the road she had walked away on, of the hollow that had followed her into every room since. She thought, too, of the way May's hand had found hers in the wagon, and the quiet in Jonah's voice when he'd said she didn't need fixing. She turned from the window and saw them both, the man at the hearth, the child by the fire, and felt something settle in her that she had not let herself feel in years. Not safety exactly, but the fragile beginning of belonging. It wasn't a grand thing, this new life. It didn't arrive all at once, wrapped in certainty. It came in bread on a wooden table, in the scrape of a chair pulled out for her, in the way Jonah met her eyes as if nothing about her presence needed permission. When the lamp was turned down and the fire's glow was the only light, she sat back in her chair, May's quiet breathing in the corner. Jonah's gaze held hers across the room, and in it she saw the truth she had been too tired to hope for. Home wasn't something given. It was something made, one small kindness at a time. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she was ready to stay.